SenseSpace. Today I'm joined by Matthew Green and Wolfgang Knorr, and we're going to be delving into an emergent conversation around climate. Matthew is a journalist at DSMOGD in the climate space, and Wolfgang, whose credentials I am not qualified to properly share at this moment, is a climate scientist and researcher. So I want to offer you both a brief moment to introduce yourselves, and then perhaps a little bit of what you're bringing to this conversation, or what you intend, or what you might hope to explore today.
Sure, go ahead.
Please.
Okay. Yes, I'm Wolfgang. I've had approximately 30 years of climate science in my career. Been working in different fields, atmospheric modeling. I've been looking even at carbon solutions by planting trees and things like that. So it's been fairly broad. I was out quite early, sort of at the time of the Rio conference in 1992. That's when I approximately started my career, and I was really enthusiastic about back then. But something was creeping in through the time that basically, I don't want to make it short. I mean, I basically had the impression, and it never went away, that nobody really takes the climate crisis seriously. So there's one thing being said at conferences, one thing being said by politicians in the media, and the other different thing sort of either being said or being expressed through actions. In the end, I basically retreated from academia. I do very little bit of science still, but not very much. And I've started, basically you could call it activism. I'm basically here to explore some new avenues in which about where that kind of activism sort of about changing the narrative on climate could go into, and I would say that's my motivation for being here. I'm totally open to new ideas. I'll pass on to Matthew.
Thanks, Wolfgang. I also share your frustration with this cognitive dissonance of one thing being said and another done, and the difficulty of living with that, especially as the crisis has become more and more pronounced. I was always very concerned about climate change, but it was never really my professional focus until 2019 or 2018, when I joined a Reuters climate reporting team. And I now work at DSMOG, which is a non-profit focused on exposing the vested interests which are blocking or delaying action on climate change. But I think I see a similar problem. We seem to be at this impasse where all sides are almost in these entrenched positions. We're having the same circular conversations, and we're not addressing the crisis. And I've always been very inspired by Jacob's work and by the potential of emergent dialogue to help unlock new ways of thinking, new perspectives, new energy, even new feelings, emotions. And I'm excited to enter into that space with you, Wolfgang, in particular on this, because of your scientific perspective, but also your courage to break with the orthodoxy. Maybe you should mention the paper you wrote about net zero for the conversation, because that was quite a big moment in the climate world.
Yes. So we started about 3 years ago, sort of with messaging. The first try was actually a letter to the Guardian, where we said game over with preventing dangerous climate change around the 1.5 goal, and we were basically saying, we're going to fail it. now it's sort of 3 years after, it's trickling through, even though if you ask climate scientists in private, they would, nobody really ever believes in it. But that original direction sort of slightly changed in the direction of net zero. So the 1.5 comes from the Paris Agreement, is the goal, sort of the ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement. And what's kind of filtered through later on was that, okay, 1.5 means net zero by 2050, which isn't true. There's a lot more complex than that, but it's sort of a goalpost just as much as 1.5. And basically, I got together with a team of other sort of activists, basically, and we had one more scientist in the group. And basically, on Earth Day, we published this article in The Conversation that basically tears apart the concept of net zero and basically says that it's a dangerous trap. And why is it a trap? Because everybody hears net, not zero. I mean, basically, that's how it works often. You know, you hear what you want to hear. And instead of hearing zero emissions, so we're talking about zero emissions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere to stop global warming, it's net zero. So that means, okay, some emissions, but also uptake, and that should be zero. So from a scientific perspective, that's all okay. The problem is, if you want to hear net, then you hear net. Basically, a net is the exit clause, and also it only says net zero far in the future. So of course it matters a lot how we get how much we emit between now and 2050, so whether, you know, the climate impact. But that's the first thing that's basically filtered out in this messaging. But why is it a trap? It's a trap because if we apply all the measures that the scientific community says are needed to get net zero by 2050, we will probably wipe out entire ecosystems, because we have to convert them into bioenergy plantations to such a massive scale that probably, and there are actually studies on that the damage done to the ecosystem is of the same order of magnitude as the damage done by the climate change would have been. So it's basically a negative impact measure. So that's either that, or we fail it, and then we have the warming, or actually we do half-hearted measures that do more harm than good, and also fail the climate agreement. So that's why it's a trap. It's you know, so you don't know whether you want to wish that the Paris Agreement fails or succeeds on the basis of these plans that are being laid out in the scientific reports. And that, yeah, that kind of shook the activist world quite a lot, because of course, everybody was like, okay, we've got progress because we've got the Paris Agreement, now we've got net zero goals. And we kind of shattered this belief in progress, I think.
I think this this first question of in a way the reception to your paper and how that cognitive dissonance is sustained, because you were essentially playing the role of the little boy in Emperor's New Clothes, but to the climate movement, and saying, look, this target that you're all so excited about, it's unworkable and will have so many negative implications that it's just, as you say, a trap. But then I guess, where does that leave us? And I think that's and I've seen this as a journalist, you know, I've written a lot about these kinds of narratives about the 1.5 degree target in the Paris Accord, about net zero targets. And I've seen how the power of those narratives takes over the conversation and shapes the limits of what it's acceptable to say and what's considered newsworthy and what isn't. And I'm reflecting now on my own role in that, in the sense that, of course, I'm very concerned. I mean, at times terrified about climate change. And there's some part of me that wants to believe in these targets, that wants to believe that although 1.5 isn't possible, at least something, maybe 1.6, and wants to think that these net zero plans are feasible. And how do we create a space to hold that contradiction? How do we reconcile the intractability of this crisis and come away from it with something sustaining or some pathway forward? So having kind of thrown your grenade, what next?
I think you said something really valuable, that these buzzwords, they shape the conversation. So, and they are of course also enshrined either in international agreements like the Paris Agreement or in IPCC reports, like the net zero goal. And that's a really important observation, because it means that while the climate issue in the view of the people who are involved, like the activists, the policymakers, the journalists, progresses because there are more agreements, and the agreements become more fine-tuned, and it's getting clearer and clearer where the goal is. So that's part of the story. What's of course not seen that much, because it's disencouraging, is that the problem actually gets worse and worse because the greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere increase while we speak, so to say, and the temperature is increase while this train of agreements is progressing. But what people forget, it's like, I mean, you're on this big ship and you're moving towards the abyss, and then there's this assembly of policymakers, scientists is walking the opposite direction on the ship, and things it's making progress, but the entire ship is moving on. And then this is sold as progress. So so this funneling of the conversation that I often fear now seems to be simply, and that you brought me to that idea, it's just simply a result of the mechanics of negotiations. So we've got more agreements, like there's more people, more countries and corporations signing up to net zero goals, for example. So there's progress in the kind of negotiation space. And because these ideas are being negotiated, then shape the conversation and allow certain conversations and disallow others. So there's this funneling effect. So what is maybe really important, or a good idea at least, is go backwards. So 1.5, how about now? Before net zero was 1.5. 1.5 is a global mean temperature. It's not regional temperature, for example. It's not precipitation change. Go back before that, it's even the climate is only one story. It's overexploitation of resources is the broader story. And then you can go even more backwards. You go to colonialism, for example, and violence towards communities who have different kinds of different ways of sustenance. Basically, that's what it is. If you're not fossil fuel based, so yeah, I think that's really important. And of course, that's also happening, and probably because there's one world that is in this funnel dictated by the negotiation process, and they have a point, because if you want to be successful in the negotiation space, you kind of have to insist that it really happens. And then there's outside of it is other conversations about sort of degrowth or we humans being part of nature and things like that. But they seem to become more and more separate. And maybe that's part of the problem.
You started to answer maybe a question that was coming up for me as you were speaking about this funneling effect, which I think is so apt. And I now work in an obviously non-profit media, which is a slightly different dynamic in terms of how the agenda is set. But when I worked in a big news organization, Reuters, absolutely. I mean, the funnel was very clear what was considered relevant to the climate story and what wasn't. And I was going to ask you, what did the funnel exclude? And you spoke about degrowth, you spoke about our relationship with nature. I wondered if you could, Wolfgang, play on that edge a little and tell us what you feel has been funneled out.
I think the more I think about it, the larger the funneling, the bigger the funneling effect seems to become. I mean, in my mind, I think very different things also have been funneled out. Very simply, people saying, well, these climate models, do they really work? Kind of that kind of feeling. I mean, there's do weather forecasts, but climate, how can you do? I mean, you can't even predict the weather 5 days in advance or a week in advance. How can you predict the climate? These kinds of ideas. I mean, you can respond to that scientifically, but there is a point. I mean, I remember when I was at the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, the second director that was appointed there, he was the head of the Medium Range Weather Forecasting Center, European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting in Reading, and then became basically a director of a climate modeling institute. And he kept saying, I don't believe the precipitation forecasts and our models. It's just, I mean, they're just there to learn something, but don't believe this stuff. And that's a conversation that nobody wants to hear. For example, I mean, especially among activists, if you doubt climate science, you're denier, a climate denier. And that conversation is not had. And also that simply the nature of models is not discussed, for example. They are basically there to get a basic understanding of the phenomenon, but they're not really, to a certain degree, they are predictive, but with a really, really massive, it's not a grain of salt, it's a whole mountain of salt. So these conversations are also being funneled out, I think. And interestingly, it's sort of both sides. If you doubt that there will even be a solution, if you, for example, doubt whether we will ever stop using fossil fuels, I think it's a very open question. And if we don't ever stop using fossil fuels, the Earth will eventually warm by something like 10 to 14 degrees. If we never do that, it depends a little bit on maybe if it take 10,000 years, it might actually not be so dramatic. But it's a really open question that's not discussed. So this, I mean, is there even a solution to the climate crisis? That kind of question is not allowed as much as the denial sort of. Is it really not? Maybe it's not so bad. That's also not allowed. And as a climate scientist, I don't really know. I still don't have a really good feeling how terrible the climate change phenomenon really is. I know that in certain areas it is, and it's certain risks there. But as soon as I start pinning down what is it really fact and what's not, and what is belief, and it becomes quite diffuse. I think the issue for me about the climate crisis is that we're playing around with a system that we don't understand, and we have no idea whether we will ever be able to stop. And it's not that, okay, from that and that warming, this and this will happen, because we don't really know that.
I really, really appreciate the sort of holes and doorways out of the funnel that you've just been making, Wolfgang. And when you said like you don't feel it in your gut, there's not like a knowing in your gut. That's really important for me, because much of this is very cerebral, and that explains a lot the dissonance that I spoke to at the beginning of like, even though I know so many people who have conviction about what the climate situation is, I can only hold that for so long up here. And insofar as it's not actually becoming a reality in my body, I let go of it, truly. And I don't think about it for whole stretches of time. And there are whole other domains of concern, you know, for my life and for human life that I ponder. And I think it's important to do so as well. And I think what comes through in what you're saying is, in some sense, the nature of the climate science conversation is scientific. It's highly rational. It's highly based on modeling and data. And there's something about that which actually couples very well with technocracy and technocratic solution. And the only way that ordinary people and most human beings can grasp that information is in a kind of cognitive way. But the whole ecological movement, and I suppose philosophy itself, is telling us actually part of the problem is that we have become disconnected between our mind and body, or even the notion that our mind is separate from our body is a big factor in this. And equally, a sense of separation from nature is a really significant factor in this. So there's something about the quality of the information itself, the way it's communicated, that actually doesn't allow us to connect deeply with our environment. And if you look at the older, the sort of older generations of the environmental movement, so much of that was about an actual deep connection with land, with preservation of land, and with all these different dimensions of ecology. And the climate movement, insofar as it's kind of gone through this technocratic tunnel, becomes so focused on carbon. And then we basically get technocratic responses to that, these pledges from governments, and like this disempowering feeling of like, our government is going to solve it, and we just need to like shout and yell and throw paint at things in order to get them to do it, and to kind of jump in front of the train. Or we get corporations and companies offering these other kinds of sort of slippery, meager things about plant-based and carbon-free and all of this stuff. But does it actually result in paradigmatic shift in our experience of life, in our relationship to the earth, ourselves? Open question for the group, but I just wanted to draw it down, because there is this kind of ontological, philosophical issue at the core that's coming through for me.
Yes, it's really interesting that the same, how you describe it, the same thing is at the beginning and in the present. You know, the separation from nature is sort of one reason for the Industrial Revolution in a way, or it was created by the Industrial Revolution. But then it also prevents us from seeing the climate crisis, well, not only in a more body-centered way, as you're saying, actually, even in a more accurate way. I think that even for scientific and philosophical reasons, the technocratic view is limited. You can, you can say, okay, it's better to actually sit there and intuit yourself into the climate phenomenon, and that would be better. But I think you can even make quite rational arguments that the scientific view on this is a fallacy, I think. And it has a lot to do with modeling and the misuse of models, which you can. I mean, I'm a modeler, and that's why I see the misuse of modelers, and I very much deplore the fact that, if something is modeled, it gets on the first page of Nature or Science magazine or whatever. And if it's data-based, then often not always, but. Or if you look at the climate reports of the IPCC, it's modeling gets like and not just at the reports, and what of it gets then into the summary for policymakers, for example, and what is then, passed on to policymakers. That's often the modeling part, and it's actually it's often so inaccurate. So, I mean, you could almost explain how it is a vehicle for denial, the modeling itself, because it really makes the problem look far simpler, and it also creates that distance to the problem. And yeah, and that's a really big challenge. It's difficult to live with that, because it's a situation that is basically dictated by how the how the climate negotiations work, who's got the power to decide what, and it's very difficult to do something against this narrow view.
Yeah, Wolfgang, when you're speaking about models, it really touches me, because when I became a climate reporter, I never thought about models, climate models particularly, and even more the models that are used to model the pathways to decarbonize. And that's really important, because the whole conversation is framed by these models, which are incredibly complex, which only people like you can really understand how they even work or what they're for. And they contain assumptions that are encoded into them by the people who build them.
Yeah.
Which then, to use that wonderful word, funnel the option. So we're like, if we accept, and I, as I'm hearing you, I'm not hearing like that we don't believe that the planet is warming because of CO2, right? I mean, that's happening. But the question is how the impacts will unfold precisely, and how rapidly certain tipping points will be reached and so on, is still to be seen, right? But we're accepting, let's say we accept, absolutely, we need to draw down or to stop emitting as soon as possible to give the system some opportunity to stabilize. But the way we do that, the model of how we do that is completely constrained by these models, which are never, essentially almost invisible. They may be mentioned briefly in the media, but they're invisible. And they work on the basis of optimizing cost, for example. So on that logic, you can continue using fossil fuels if you come up with some technology to capture the emissions, or you can continue with other activities, which when actually the kind of radical or systemic transformation that I think we're kind of pointing towards is just off the table. So if I was to add to your list of excluded questions, and it's creeping in more now, but for a long time, the idea of degrowth or some kind of more radical reform of the whole neoliberal compact has been also mostly eclipsed. I mean, certainly when I was at Reuters, it was not something. I mean, I managed to write the odd thing about that, but it just wasn't a conversation anyone was thinking about. People just weren't even thinking about this. And if you raised it in a meeting or kind of proposed a story on it, I was seen as quite suspect. I mean, really, I was made to there was no space to deviate really outside of the, you know, if you were on on the motorway on the rumble strip, you suddenly feel like I'm drifting. I better go back into the middle lane. You know, I'm in danger here. And actually, in the end, I left because I couldn't stand it. But well, there were various reasons. But part of it was I just thought, what are we doing? We're actually, by not challenging this architecture that we're kind of enmeshed in, we're part of the problem. As long as we're not asking some of these questions, we perpetuate that tunnel. And I recognize even what I'm saying is like super abstract, because it took me months to even know vaguely what I'm trying to say, and I haven't even said it very clearly even now. But it took me a long time to get to that point, to realize, wow, like it's all about the models. They underneath all of this discussion, policy, science, media, headlines, communications, it's all about the assumptions that go into these models, which are just mental constructs. They're not actually real at all. And some of them have been very accurate, and we know that temperatures are rising, and we know that, you know, there's, I'm not going down the kind of Jordan Peterson road here, Jacob, just to be clear. But there are, I absolutely acknowledge that limiting effect, and the modeling and the kind of the mental models are not very embodied, right? I don't think anyone sits and goes, am I feeling this model? Like, can we feel this model? Are they sitting around at the International Energy Agency or at the IPCC thinking, you know, do we really feel this? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe a good modeler, I'm sure Wolfgang, as a modeler, maybe you do kind of get a tingle when you've got the, you know, you've tuned it right. But I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, the inventor of, I mean, it's either model of a law of physics. It's often about intuition. That's interesting. But once it's there, then it's not. And then, okay, there's a difference, of course, between the atmospheric models, for example, and these economic models, because they're not no hard laws of physics. You know, it's just assumptions, and assumptions that they often use so-called general equilibrium models in economics, and they don't have money in it. For example, there's no money. It's all goods and services are immediately exchanged. So all the debts are settled immediately. This is one of the assumptions. That's how they work. But you could use different ones, but they're very, very deeply hardwired assumptions in there, that even you value things. I mean, what you value, that even value, you know, and what you don't value, so, and how you value things, and they're often unspoken and not even discussed, or probably maybe even not seen as conscious decisions by the people who use them.
This is what came to me. It's like this deep level of wiring in the system, in the global system.
Yeah,
it's just never questioned, but it's influencing everything that's above it, right up to the headline I'm writing, and right up to the kind of question that I'm thinking of asking. Like, that's what really blew me away, was the idea that it can all be traced back down to these assumptions, these like almost like a black box.
No, it's a kind of modern oracle, really. You could, I mean, all these assumptions and all these ideas about bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, and the kind of the potential. So you could just go on the internet and then, you know, get some numbers out, and like kind of back of the envelope, you could come to the exact same conclusions. It's just packaged in these complicated models so that it sounds credible.
But
it's just like an oracle, you know. You had to your ceremony with some smoke and fire, you know, and then it's credible. If you just say, oh, that's how it is, who are you?
and it serves certain interests. Like, if we
Exactly.
why is it we're looking at this crisis, we're looking at wildfires burning out of control, the Horn of Africa is being basically wiped out by drought. I mean, the list of disasters unfolding is multiplying. Huge parts of the global south, but not just the global south. Germany has been underwater, right? I mean, it's just closing in. In an alternate reality, if you had a different kind of relationship between governments, corporations, different kind of democracy, you'd be like, you know what? We actually need to wind down the fossil economy. We have the technology to do it. We'll nationalize these companies. We'll do a fair settlement. Like, it's like future generations. It's just a sort of sensible thing to do. but we're so paralyzed. We're so fragmented that when they look back, if they look back, they'll think, how was it that humans had become so incapable of coherent action that they were paralyzed in the face of this existential threat? And the model is like part of that to me. It's like somehow symptomatic of that. It's like there's some deeper level that we need to reach as a species in our consciousness, where we land in ourselves and it becomes obvious. I mean, we abolished slavery eventually, right? I say we, I mean, I don't want to take credit for the UK's role, but, you know, we as a global society, I mean, we have gone through phase shifts where we go through epochs. The Berlin Wall fell and communism collapsed. You know, sudden tipping points can get reached, but I just wonder what the conditions would have to look like for us as a global species to sort of suddenly wake up and say, actually, we can we can mitigate this. We've got all the technology. We just have to make slightly different choices. Why are we so stuck?
Matthew, when I hear the possibility of the phase shift, it really doesn't seem to me that phase shift is some recognition about carbon. Like, that just doesn't seem like it can be the thing that actually gives rise to the coherence problem that you've identified. Something to do with the actual space of conversation that's available inside of Reuters, companies, media, and so on. Like that's invisible ontological box that's part of the funnel that extends beyond just the model area into the whole of the available cultural space of what can be said, what can't be said, how a conversation can be conducted. And so when there's almost this reciprocal feedback where the model determines the space of what's possible, but then the space of what's possible in thinking about the model is already predetermined by this kind of cultural architecture, this way of being, this way of seeing. And at a deeper level, none of the models and the conversations are accounting for a topography of consciousness as at all relevant or meaningful. They're really considering it a flat terrain of we think in this way, and it's a hidden assumption, and it's also going to stay the same into the future. But if that's not the case, and there's actually a radical topography available that is shifting and may actually be catalyzed by the shifts in the biosphere into the noosphere, into this area of mind and collective cognition, then things can change in ways, you know, quite unexpectedly. And so I grapple with the hubris of thinking that we can know when we don't know shit. and we can't predict very much at all in our own lives, or at the level of what's going to happen with global instability politically or economically in a few years, what the consequences will be of that, bearing on to the actual relationship between mankind, machinery, the burning of fuels, and the biosphere, the complexity of which we also are, I feel in some ways, being arrogant to presume we can understand how all of that complexity is going to interact using this kind of rational power of mind. And this is certainly outside the bounds of Reuters' conference room, but for me, it feels like actually the shift into a kind of deeper knowing and relationship to nature is going to be the thing that gives rise to the right actions that are supportive of rebalancing the biosphere. But it's going to come from, it's almost going to be as if the environment tells us what we need to do, rather than us coming up with it, in the boardroom and then trying to map it onto the environment and ending up doing all kinds of absurd things like growing loads of forests agriculturally so we can then burn them and then inject everything that we capture the carbon into the ground in some sort of reverse fracking, and it doesn't seem very likely to get us where we want to go.
Maybe a first step is really to start feeling how much of a cult we are in. When Matthew was talking about sort of the unfolding crisis, and then how obvious the measures would be, but nobody's taking them. It reminded me of some civilization doing some bizarre cult, and then some environmental impact starting, but they're so focused on that cult that they just don't want to see it. And I think that's somehow where we are. I mean, it's maybe a bit difficult. We don't have pyramids. We have like consumer society, and it's not as tangible maybe as like in other civilizations. But I think the first step is really to see in what kind of bizarre cult we live. And I often have the impression that it's kind of the lay people who get it most, and not the people invested professionally in this little bit here of the system and this little bit. And especially the scientists don't get it. I sometimes get the feeling. And, at the beginning of this film, A Planet of the Humans, he's asking the, passers-by, how many years does humanity have? And they all sort of say, 20 years or so. It's like, I'm joking, so a bit. But it's not a taboo subject, to talk about sort of, we are this kind of crazy species that is doing something completely irrational. And if you just ask some random people, but I think in professional circles, in the media and politics, it's forbidden conversation. And so what it boils down to then is a power question, because it's really, the professional class or the political class, having a grip on the conversation. Then that's what I perceive, at least.
I love what you just said about people asking how many years humanity has got. I mean, I even remember walking across the newsroom at Reuters, and people would make comments like that in a way and just carry on at the desk. And I have a perspective on this, because I've been maybe like you, Wolfgang, you have spent your career in this academy, right? So you're very familiar, but you're also no longer in the academy in the same way. And I spent my whole career weaving in and out of Reuters or Financial Times or like these big establishment media organizations. And that's partly why I'm no longer in them, I think, because the cognitive dissonance for me working there, even in a climate, like almost especially in like a climate role, was so intense that I felt like, in fact, I more or less did say this, you know, if we were to be acknowledging the implications of what we're writing in the file about climate change, that implies sweeping change across all levels of our organization and on how we approach almost every story and what we just, it's so profound, but it was not, that was just not a conversation that was going to be welcome. And of course, the reason is obvious, is that if you're in that system, it's like you're in the collapsing pyramid, you're in the upper berths on Titanic. You don't want to be reminded that the water's pouring in below the waterline because it's too uncomfortable. And okay, they'll make concessions here and there, you know, but really it's tokenistic relative to what we're actually in, right? And that's why for me, like, I have a lot less, I mean, I now work, I mean, I would never be able to even enter this conversation if I was still at Reuters, because I wouldn't be permitted to engage in this kind of public platform in this way. It just wouldn't be allowed. So now I work at a nonprofit where I can basically say what I think. And that already is a relief to my system. I mean, even if not many people are listening to what I'm saying, probably more on this platform than many of my others, but it doesn't matter. My system feels more integrated. I feel more relaxed. I feel more well, in a sense. And because there's cognitive dissonance, the volume is, I mean, there's still the background cognitive dissonance of just living in Western society, but the acute form of being in a role where I was supposedly reporting on the crisis, but all of these kinds of elements were just off the table, has now been dialed down. And that feels very healthy to me. And obviously there's a sacrifice. I don't get paid the same salary, right? So I can see why people cling to those structures. But I also feel that it's really unhealthy to be trapped there as well. And I'm much happier now that I can say what I think and feel.
Yeah, there's something in when Wolfgang spoke about like the cult that we're in, the word that was coming to me was like addiction and addict. Like it's very prototypical of addict-like behavior to be just like continuing in the path you're on and seeing like, oh, that's, you know, falling apart and this is, and my body's breaking down, but I'm still going. And that dissonance of the addict that can't stop on the track they're on, even when the body and all these indicators are pointing otherwise. And that, you know, that connects obviously with what Matthew's engaging in with Thomas Hubel and the collective trauma work, because ultimately, if we're calling fossil fuels an addiction, if we're calling the paradigm in some sense an addiction, the resolution of that only comes from getting to where the pain is and getting to the bottom of the suffering. And therein we have actually not just, you know, traumas from war and disconnection from nature and so on, but I would say spiritual wounds, deep ontological wounds in which we've been cut off from, you know, the solace of the afterlife, or, you know, whatever relationship to God that brings people peace to accept. And I think in the absence of some deep spiritual resources, people actually are not going to be able to confront the dissonance that Matthew identified. And they will live in that because it's dreadful to actually sit into what the information is telling them. And you can't do that unless there's almost like this post-tragic possibility of seeing it, confronting it, and almost feeling okay on the other side of it, and then having agency to act again.
And the fascinating thing is that that even works when the solution is even there. What I've heard a lot during my active career as a climate scientist is that, okay, the price for renewables will eventually fall so much that the fossil fuels will become uneconomical, and then the problem is going to be solved. Now, you can actually demonstrate that doesn't work. One place which probably has the highest potential per capita for renewables in any rich countries would be Australia. Solar energy is an absolute paradise, and it has by far the lowest uptake of electric vehicles in any rich country. For example, I just read an article about this. Or renewable energy has a really, really hard times there, and it's the solution is just right there. I mean, you could say, okay, in Northern Europe, it's a bit more difficult with solar power. You need to use wind power, and it's all a little bit complicated, all that. But even if the solution is right there, and the excuse has already been, okay, we can't get off fossil fuels because we have this economy. It can only be powered by fossil fuels, and they are cheaper and all that. But this is starting not to be true anymore. But we can't really see any sign, that really a shift in the perception, and that I find really, really telling, and it points into the direction you were saying, Jacob, of an addiction. And maybe the addiction goes further. It's also the destruction of the natural world is an addiction, or it's a trauma-driven response to something, and maybe we feel some kind of, we're living out some kind of trauma in the use of fossil fuels. Maybe that. I mean, it's difficult to grasp, but it's just possible.
I think there's a lot of, that's a very rich line of questioning, and this is obviously at the core of a lot of the work I'm doing with Thomas Hubel in the collective trauma space. On one level, to speak to what you were saying, Jacob, I agree. Like, the information is too much. We, of course, will stay in cognitive dissonance because we don't have the resourcing to host it within us, unless we develop practices like the global social witnessing that we do with the Pocket Project, where we do really come together very consciously to in community to help each other regulate and connect, to confront this and digest it, to confront these situations and digest them in our system. But I also think you're right, Wolfgang, underneath it is a trauma. There's an imbalance that's so deep and so endemic in our species that we don't even see it. We see it as normal. Like Thomas Hubel talks about trauma agreements, these unconscious agreements we make about how the world is, how things are, that are actually trauma responses. And what the story of that trauma is gets very complex. And Jacob, you talked about wars and how they live on in us. And I wonder if you go back deeper to dispossession from the land and industrialization and levels and layers and all colonialism and slavery and all of these aspects. It feels to me like we're in a kind of like a healing crisis, on an optimist, either in a terminal phase, or I like to think we're in the healing crisis where we can't repress it anymore. The symptoms are so florid now. They're so glaring that they require our attention. They require us to have conversations of the kind that we've never had before. I wasn't talking to people like this a few years ago. No way, really. So something is emerging through this, but where it's going, obviously, I wouldn't like to predict.
Yeah, I really love that healing crisis juxtaposition there, Matthew. Really, really excellent. And I think the powerful function of that idea is that it resolves the wound of the separation of our inner world and the external reality. And of course, like the addict who's suffering and then having all these symptoms showing up in the outside world, it's in some sense the same, scaled up. The collective human inner world is being expressed in the human outer world. And you can even see that in the nature of the architecture, the kind of buildings we create, the environments we create for ourselves is such an expression of our inward philosophy and our sense of what's valuable, what's beautiful, what's meaningful. And so, of course, there's some connection here. But I also want to, as we draw to a close, just also posit the idea that in some sense, it may be an expression of a trauma that we've gone down this path of industrialization and oil and fuel and hypercharged the development of human civilization. But there's a way that we can also kind of lovingly accept that as a necessary stage, insofar as that is giving rise to the birth of a new consciousness that's able to hold it and integrate it, healing those separations whilst also not going back, because I don't think we can go back, certainly not completely in the way that some people would like to. There's some virtue in the progress. There's some virtue in the technology. And I want to just thank you both for this really, really interesting dialogue. And certainly we've just opened and started to stir the pot, but it's been so powerful to play with this funnel and this opening up of the funnel and opening it in this space of conversation. And I hope that other people can begin to do that as well. And I'll just pass it to Wolfgang and Matthew if you have any closing remarks or things you didn't get to include.
I kind of feel it's a bit similar. I think it's really important to relax at this stage. That's the best way to allow the energy to keep flowing, the dialogue not to freeze up, and maybe see this hardening of the conversation of the funnels. Maybe it's the kind of the final stages of this healing crisis that Matthew was saying, is that maybe it will become more obviously kind of pathological situations, a visible one, whereas, I mean, even just after this conversation, I feel like the best thing is just a little bit to relax and see it all as an organic thing. Even this whole path that we went through, that we were just describing, Jacob, through industrialization, maybe it's just been our destiny to do this, and maybe we have to let go of the idea that we have to stick to it. Maybe it's just a phase in our species evolution, and we just should relax a little bit, as I was saying.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard my wife Genevieve making a cup of tea a moment ago, but she's a clinical psychologist, and she's doing a course right now in the other room on internal family systems, which is where you look at parts. Like, we all have so many parts. We have the manager who's in control and tries to fix everything and is people pleasing and perfectionist. We have the firefighter who gets angry or addicted or goes into a rage. And we have the exile feeling like sad, worthless, kind of curling up into a ball. Like, all of these parts are always kind of vying in us to be integrated and to be seen. And so many of them get repressed or pushed away or covered in shame. And I feel like we're looking at something like that on a kind of global collective level. Like, how can we work through all of these contradictions and tensions? And we're seeing it bubbling in the surface and in every direction. But like Jacob says, there's something underneath all this. Maybe there's something that we can't perhaps see, and I get a lot of faith in to go back to your point, Jacob, of just not knowing. Like we know some facts, but we also don't know what we don't know, and leaving open that possibility that there are layers to this, which we're only just starting to get glimpses of. That topography, I love that phrase, that topography of consciousness is what really keeps me going through all this. So thank you. I've really taken a lot from this exchange. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Wolfgang and Jacob, for being such an skilled and articulate host as ever.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you, Wolfgang, for joining us.
Thanks, Jacob, for hosting.